Hey everybody, welcome back to Portugal and Beyond. Thank you so much for checking out my channel. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Today's topic is going to be the differences as well as some of the similarities between U.S. apartment construction and apartment construction here in Portugal. I'm going to talk first about the buildings in general because much of it's the same, but there are some nuances and some differences between U.S. construction and Portuguese construction. And then later on, I will talk about the apartment specifically, some of the things that you should be thinking about if you're looking to move here and purchase an apartment or rent one in the coming years. So things that you need to be aware of. I want to thank Rachel, one of my subscribers, for making this a suggestion. So I hope this, Rachel, you find this good information. I hope the rest of you grab your pen and paper because I'm going to go through kind of a laundry list of items that I think are important when you're looking at apartments and some of the differences and similarities between what you find in the US and what you will here in Portugal. So let's talk about the building itself. Going to be made the same way. You're looking at the brick and mortar, the block construction. Some newer buildings in Portugal as well as the US might be metal framing as opposed to the block or brick. In the US, you might have more wood construction than you will in Portugal. But the exterior and the look are very similar, except in Portugal, many of the older buildings will still have tiles on them, so kind of give it a more glamorous look than a typical apartment building, let's say in the US. But the exterior is very similar. You have doorbells right inside the entryways of the buildings, both in the US and Portugal. You're going to have your mailboxes, things of that nature. Some of the differences that you're going to find in buildings is in a typical US building, because of fire codes and because of building codes, you're going to have fire escapes, where typically in Portuguese buildings, you're not going to have fire escapes. The fire escape is going to be in the middle of the building where the stairs are to get to your flat. That's where it's going to be. There won't be any external escapes, if you will. So that's something that we found to be a difference between the US and Portugal. Things like elevators are typical in most U.S. buildings. In Portugal, it's not. It's not like you win the lottery if you happen to find a elevator. They call them lifts here. But when you're searching for apartments, you do need to check the box to say look for elevator or lift, because you can't assume that a building, whether it be 2 or 3 floors high or several floors high, is going to have an elevator here. So if it's something that is important to you, definitely need to make sure, because it's not a given. Many older buildings like ours does not have a lift, but many newer ones, and I'll say within the last 5 to 7 years, more of them are being built with lifts. Some older buildings might be retrofitted, but many of them are not here. So typical US apartment building has an elevator and lift. Here, not so much. Also, with that, HOA fees, common area fees in apartment buildings in the US, I'll say depending on where you live, either you're not paying an HOA fee or a common area fee. That's wrapped up into the monthly rental cost or fee that you're paying. In some places like the East Coast of the US, you might have separate fees that you're paying for residency in certain apartment complexes. In Portugal, it's very similar. Sometimes it's just wrapped up into the rental fee. Sometimes you'll pay an extra HOA. They don't call it that, but it's sort of the same thing, like an association fee. So for example, we pay €9 a month. Granted, we don't have an elevator that needs to be maintained. We just have a staircase that gets cleaned a couple of times a week. We don't have any shrubbery, any exterior lawn or other maintenance. So ours is very basic. But we do have friends here that pay hundreds a month because they have a fitness center in their building. They have a pool. They have an area to be able to lay out in the summertime. And that's similar in the US. So there are fees associated, sometimes are wrapped up again in your monthly fee Sometimes it's a separate fee, but that's similar to the US. So you will find that to be something that I would expect if you're looking for apartments in Portugal. Um, Lastly, with that, when you're looking at the exterior of the building, I would say don't judge a book by its cover. In the US, you might have buildings that look nice, but when you go inside, they may not be as nice. In Portugal, it's almost the reverse. Our building, for example, our apartment, I'll get into that, is been newly renovated, our specific apartment, but the outside doesn't look that great. There's paint falling off. In fact, a good portion of our building, the paint is chipped away, where I wish that we would be able to get new paint, but that's, and again, association decision, not our decision. But sometimes don't judge a book by its cover. The outside may be drab, but when you go inside, it's pretty nice. So let's do that. Let's go inside and talk about the inside of a typical apartment, some of the same things and differences between US and Portugal. So let's start out with walls of all things, because it's common for us, as you can see the photo over here, to put things on walls. In the US, it's almost exclusively drywall with few exceptions. In Portugal, it's almost exclusively plaster with few exceptions. So, for example, this photo right here is put up with 3M strips. It's a light photo, so it's going to hang on the plaster wall with that. If we're looking to hang heavier things, then we have to drill into the wall and be careful, because if we're nailing or drilling too fast, we could chip the plaster, and then that could cause you problems on your refund fees if you're renting an apartment, or you just have to pay for someone to fix the plaster in Portugal. Whereas in the US, you put a hole in the wall, you can easily cover that in drywall. So that's something that is different between typical US construction and typical Portuguese construction. I'll go one step further and let's talk about inside the walls. Most of the construction in the US, there's some level of insulation provided. That is a building code in almost every state or within every city, or federal guidelines. In Portugal, that's not the case. So even though our apartment is a newly renovated apartment, there was zero insulation put into the walls. So our building, I think, is from the 40s, and our apartment was redone, I want to say, in 2018. There's no insulation, so even though it is 60 degrees outside, it's actually warmer outside right now than in our apartment. That's why I'm wearing a sweatshirt inside. So sometimes you have to be very careful and cautious. You can't assume that all the buildings are going to have nice insulation to where it's going to be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. That's not the case. You have to be looking for that and look for an energy rating in Portugal. If it has an A, B, or C rating, most likely it's got some level of insulation. If it's got a lower rating, it may have none. Most newer constructed apartments in Portugal come with some level of insulation. Most older buildings, whether they're being redone or they're original, don't. So it is an important thing you need to think about when you're choosing an apartment. That is a nuance and a little bit of a difference from what you're experiencing in the US. So also, let's go along with the heat and the cold. In the US, typically most apartments will have central air and heat. Most apartments in Portugal will not. Central air and heat is a rare thing in Europe, let alone Portugal. So if you're looking for heat and air options, you'll have to buy what will be called mini splits. They're little units that go into each room, or space heaters or space coolers. Or when you're looking for an apartment to rent or to buy, make sure that you're looking for something that says heating and air included, so it has these units as opposed to nothing. Again, there may be some parts of Portugal that you move to that you don't need them at all, but I would say that even though it doesn't snow in Lisbon, it's much cooler in our apartment than we anticipated, so we're glad that we have some heat in the winter. And then in the summer, it can be humid. It's not so much it's overwhelming heat, it's more the humidity. So our units actually have the ability to have an dehumidifying aspect, which is helpful in the summertime for us. So something to consider for sure. That's a little bit of a difference from what you're expecting in the US versus what you're getting in Portugal. Let's talk about plumbing. Plumbing is always an interesting issue. The In the US, you have, I don't know all the plumbing codes and issues, but I can tell you here in Portugal some things that are unique or different. In the US, if you have an apartment, it's going to come with a washer and dryer almost always, or in the apartment complex, either in the basement or somewhere, there'll be a common area where there'll be at least a washer, dryer, if not washer and dryers for you to use. In Portugal, most apartments come with a washer. It's rare to have a dryer, a separate dryer unit in any Portuguese apartment, and that's not just Portugal, that's in Europe in general. You may find some that have a washer-dryer combo in the same unit. So it's one machine that does both things, but that's rare. Most likely you're going to find a washer with some clotheslines out the back or front of the apartment to hang your clothes, or you have a rack that you can put up in your apartment to be able to use. So that's one of the main differences that you're going to find. And unless you have extra space to be able to purchase a dryer from a store and put it in your apartment, you're probably going to have to use a laundromat to get a dryer if you want to have dry clothes that way versus hanging them outside. The second thing about plumbing is the toilets, and in the bathroom specifically. Most US apartments have what I call a standalone toilet. So it has the toilet, it has the back of the toilet, you take the lid off if you need to fix things. In Portugal and much of Europe, you'll find, I'll call it stand-in toilets, I like to call them. I don't know the name of them, but you have the toilet itself, but the back of the toilet is actually in the wall. So to get into the guts, if your toilet's leaking or running or malfunctioning, you have to put your hands into the walls, and it becomes a pain to be able to fix and take the guts out and restore them if there's issues. But it's something that you need to be aware of, because most of the places that we've looked at, as well as all of our friends, have the same type of toilet. It's not the standalone concept. It's kind of built into the wall. So that's something that's different. You just need to be aware of that. Everything else is pretty much the same when it comes to plumbing here, whether it be in the US or in Portugal. But those are two differences. The washer dryer as well as the toilets are a little unique. Along with those lines, the hot water heater. In the US, often you'll find them in a separate room or closet, or maybe where the laundry room is. Here in Portugal, it's generally, you'll see them in the kitchen, in the bathroom. That's usually where they put them. Because we have a renovated apartment, they happen to put ours in a spare closet, which would be similar to what we would expect in the US, but that's a little different. So it may throw you off when you're doing dishes and right above you is the hot water heater, or when you're taking a shower, right next to you is the hot water tank. That's common in Portugal and in Europe. So just something that you need to be aware of. Flooring. I would say, generally speaking, in the US, it's all over the place. You name it, you're going to have wood, tile, laminate, carpet. In Portugal, I'm going to say you're going to have mostly wood or tile. You might have some laminate. We have laminate in a renovated place, but most places that we've gone into, it's been wood or tile. It's rare to see carpet here. Most people have area rugs. That's more of a European thing than carpet. You won't have much laminate, excuse me. We have laminate, but most of the places that we've gone into are wood, almost like a parquet floor look to it, or tile, whereas US, it could be all over the map. So if that's the thing for you, you may want to ask about that when looking at listings and looking at properties to rent or to buy. It may not be a big thing whatsoever. Electricity. One big thing to keep in mind is that the voltage, how it's done, is different in the US than in Europe, in particular in Portugal. So you'll want to make sure that you have adapters, and the same things that you can get for when you're flying as a tourist at the airport, or you can get on Amazon, the little adapters for your phones and laptops. We use those. We made the mistake of bringing an Instapot to the US, or excuse me, from the US to Portugal. It blew up within seconds because we didn't realize that we had to get a converter to make sure that it didn't overpower the unit. So it's very important that if you're bringing electronics from the US outside of your phones or laptops, make sure that you have the proper adapter converter so that you don't blow them up when you move overseas. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, I didn't mention this before with the heating in the air, but it is something that when you get an apartment in Portugal, which is unique from the US, whatever you use for your wattage and your electricity or your gas, you just pay. Specifically in Portugal, if you use more electricity than what the past renter or past owner used, you will have to contact the maintenance company to up your plan or give you an increased allowance of electricity. So we found that because our apartment wasn't used for several months before we moved, that after turning on a couple of lights, the power went out and the switch was flipped. We had to flip the breaker, and it's because of the amount of electricity used was at a lower amount for so many months, so that the company reduced the plan on the apartment. So make sure when you're moving to Portugal that you find out how much electricity you may be running, and then you might have to change your plan with the company as such, depending on how much you're using. Let's talk about windows. That's probably one of the last things. In the US, you have everything from windows that in older buildings are 100, 200 years old. You have that in Portugal too. I will say that in Portugal, the windows and doors outside of our door into our hallway, but the ones that are attached to windows are very secure. They don't have drafts. They keep out a lot of the noise, which is great. And even though the windows are single pane, they do a really good job of keeping in the heat or air, or keeping it out, depending on your perspective. One thing to keep in mind that is typical in Portugal that's not typical in the US are shutters. And what I mean by that are not the old school shutters that you see in older houses, let's say along the East Coast or New England area of the US. I'm thinking more of shutters that come down. Either you pull them down or they're electronically, they go up and down. We have electronic shutters. Most of the people around us have the manual shutters. That's something that's a little unique here in Portugal. It helps a little bit with the bills as far as keeping some of the heat or air in or out, depending on your perspective. Also helps with some of the noise too at night if you're in a busy area. Those are most, if I could think of, the main construction points that I would look for that I think are similar or different to the US. So this is a longer video than what I normally do. I apologize for that. I like to keep them short and sweet, but I wanted to go into more detail into what you need to be looking for when choosing an apartment here in Portugal, as opposed to what you may be used to getting in the United States. So hope you enjoyed it, and as always, have a great day.